So you want to build an electrical system, but you're not sure what components you need. All right, let me walk you through it. Basically, there are 3 different parts of an electrical system. I'm simplifying this, okay? You need a way to harvest the energy, you need a way to distribute the energy, and you need to be able to store it. Simple as that. And you probably know how to harvest energy. Usually that's through solar panels. To distribute the energy, well, you're going to need some cables, aren't you? Otherwise, it's not an electrical circuit and the electrons can't flow. And finally, storing energy. A battery. That's done. You can click out of the video now if you want. However, there is actually a lot more to an electrical system, and I'm going to unpack it for you right now so that you can build the perfect system for your needs. And guess what? What's perfect for me isn't going to be perfect for you, but by the end of the video, you're going to know what bits you need to make the system of your dreams. Let's start at the beginning. Harvesting energy. The most common way that you will see in off-grid setups is using solar panels. Simple. You could have a flexible solar panel, you could have a rigid solar panel, you could have a high voltage solar panel, you could have a lower voltage solar panel. There are so many different options. The 2 main types of solar panels are monocrystalline and polycrystalline. Polycrystalline panels are generally cheaper than monocrystalline. However, the trade-off is that they are less efficient. Monocrystalline panels are far more efficient. They tend to have a longer lifespan. They're better in low light conditions, and they fit more wattage in the same footprint. So if you are trying to put panels where there's not much space, you are going to be able to fit more wattage or harvest more energy if you use a monocrystalline panel versus a polycrystalline panel. So I guess the 2 things really to keep in mind are your budget and the space you have available. Monocrystalline has a higher upfront cost, but like I said, longer lifespan and more efficient. Most new panels, if you are buying new, are monocrystalline these days anyway, but it's good to be aware of, especially if you are buying secondhand, where there are going to definitely be polycrystalline panels available. Other ways you could harvest energy: hydropower. You're probably not going to do that if you are living in your van or you've got a little off-grid cabin and there's no source of water, but that is a way to harvest energy. And another popular one, wind turbines. Again, you're probably not going to use that if you're doing a setup for your van or caravan. Oh, there's a little baby bird. Oh my goodness, love, can you hear it? I think it's stuck. Look, hey Papa. Oh no. Oh. Hello, gorgeous. Bye. You gonna go off and harvest some energy, eat some worms? Another thing you need to think about is not only harvesting energy, but also producing energy in different ways. A mains charger, that is one way to do it. This is something that you plug into a mains outlet and then attach to your batteries in your van, and it will charge them up. But another way is actually through a DC-DC charger. This is perfect if you have got a caravan or a camper van motorhome type setup, because what it does, it uses your alternator when you're driving to not only charge your vehicle's battery, but also your house battery, which are your batteries that are powering your off-grid setup. It's just a good way to have redundancy. The more ways you have to charge, the safer it is. I currently do not have a DC-DC charger in my system because I was overly confident that my solar panels were big enough to harvest enough energy to power my system. Boy, was I wrong. After living in the van for over 2 years, I have realised that having only a mains charger as my backup isn't the best, because often I'm in more remote or regional places where I don't have access to power, or it's inconvenient to drive and plug into mains power. So a DC-DC charger, all I'd have to do is run the engine or go for a drive and I am able to top up my batteries. So we've got a way to harvest energy, but that's no good in and of itself, because we need it to be in a usable voltage. Most off-grid setups in a van are at 12 volt, but solar panels, you can get them 40 volt ones, 60 volt ones, 24 volt, 16 volt, all different voltages, and the voltages fluctuate depending on the weather conditions. So being able to convert the voltage is really, really important. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to use your accessories. You're not going to be able to charge your phone, plug your fan in, power the lights, none of that. So to get the right voltage from solar panels, or it would be the same for other ways of harvesting energy, you need a charge controller. This essentially is what the solar panels feed into, and whatever the voltage the panels are giving to the charge controller, it will do some magic and spit out a voltage that your system can use. There's two main types of charge controller. There's a PWM charge controller and an MPPT charge controller. Now, maybe 5 years ago, the PWM, a lot of people were still using because it was cheaper. But now, MPPT charge controllers, you can get them really affordably, and it's the way to go because it's the most efficient way to convert that voltage, because energy is actually used when converting that voltage. So you want it to be as efficient as possible. Now, you might also want to be powering mains appliances, such as a microwave, a kettle, an air conditioner. And to be able to do that, you need a way to convert DC electricity into AC electricity. And that would be generally from 12 volts to whatever your mains voltage is. Here in Australia, 230 volts. And the component that does that is an inverter. Some people don't have an inverter because they don't want or need to power mains appliances, and that's fine. For me, I'm a bit bougie. I've got my air fryer, I've got my air conditioner, I've got my microwave, I've got my kettle. I like to power all of that through mains, and I want to be able to do it off grid. So I use an inverter that converts the DC electricity to AC electricity so that I can power those devices using my battery. But before we get onto batteries and storing the energy, I want to talk about being able to distribute the energy, because that obviously is really important. If you can't distribute it, all that energy you are harvesting is not going to do anything. It's not going to power anything because you're not distributing it. So obviously the most obvious one is cables. You need cables to create that electrical circuit. You need to appropriately size these cables. I haven't covered that in this video. It's going to be an entirely separate video because it's quite in depth. You need to understand it properly, but just know you'll need to be buying different sized cables. You're not going to get away with using the same size cable. Sorry to say it. Another component you should be using are bus bars, and essentially bus bars is a way to neatly and safely organize your cables. So if you have your battery and you want your inverter connected to it, and you want your MPPT charge controller connected to it, and you want all these different things, that's fine. But if you're having lugs stacked on top of each other, which is what goes on the end of a cable, that's not the safest to be putting on one battery terminal. So instead you have one cable coming off the battery that leads into a bus bar, which basically has multiple lugs on it for lots of different cables to join to. Really simple. Other ways to distribute energy, if you're thinking about using mains energy, is a power inlet. So on the outside of my van, I have a power inlet. I plug in a cable so that when I'm at a caravan park or parked up at someone's house and I don't want to use my batteries, I can use their electricity. And you're also going to need some power outlets. So for mains, that would be power points, but for your 12 volt or DC devices, that could be things like a cigarette socket, a USB port, things like that. They are the power outlets because it's giving power out, whereas the inlet is taking the power in so that it can then be distributed in your circuit. Next, storing energy. Better get my bit of paper to be consistent. Storing energy is actually optional, and I'm going to do a video on that because, believe it or not, you don't actually need a battery to be able to run your things off-grid. However, most of us want to be able to power our system any time of day or night. And if we are relying on solar power, that's obviously going to be an issue when there's no sunlight. So, to store your energy, you will need a battery or a battery bank if you've got multiple batteries. There are different types of batteries. Two common ones are AGM batteries and lithium batteries. Now, when I say lithium, I am specifically referring to lithium iron phosphate batteries. They are probably one of the safer types of batteries, and that is what's used in off-grid settings. But there are other types of lithium batteries. We don't need to go into it, but it's important for you to know. For example, most phones will use a lithium-ion battery. They're actually not as safe. They're much more flammable. Before we move on, let me walk you through some of the differences between AGM and lithium batteries. I will do a separate video going in depth about this, so this is just a general overview. It should give you enough info though for you to get an idea of what battery you need. Here is a graph that shows the cycle life for AGM batteries. On the y-axis here, we have depth of discharge, or DOD. So if, for example, it was 10% depth of discharge, you are only using 10% of the battery's capacity, or drawing it down to 90% full. And life cycles is how many cycles you can get if you are drawing it down 10%. So if we look here, if we are only doing a 10% depth of discharge, let's follow it across. That's 4,500 cycles for an AGM battery. But you can that would be only using 10% of the capacity, which is nuts. They recommend that you don't draw AGM batteries below 50%, because if you do, you start doing very permanent damage. But let's look at this. If we're using half the battery's capacity, that's 1,000 life cycles. Now, these are just general numbers. Every battery is going to be slightly different, but they fall within this ballpark. So you would be able to drain your battery down 50%, 1,000 times before it really starts to be degraded enough to be like, much less capacities. Probably still going to work. Whether it does, another story. So if you thought, okay, if I am doing a life cycle every day, for example, that's 1,000 divided by 365, that's a year, 365 days. That would be 2.7 years. So what's that in like everyday language? 2 years and 8 months. Not bad. Okay, cool. But remember, you're only able to use 50% of the battery. If you are drawing it down, say using 90% of the battery, look how much it drops. Only 500 cycles. You wouldn't even get 2 years out of it. And AGM batteries are not going to cope with having 100% of their capacity used. So really, why are the capacities rated how they are if you can't actually use it all? Crazy to me, in my opinion. Anyway, let's now look at lithium. Again, these are just general figures. And I have just noticed that this might be AI generated, because look how they have written cycle life on the y-axis there. Isn't that interesting? Anyway, they have flipped the axis this time. They have got depth of discharge down here and cycle life up there, but same. If we were using for example, 20% of the battery, we would be getting 5,000 cycles. So if we do the same thing, 5,000 divided by 365, that's over 13 and a half years. But you're probably going to be using more than 20% of the capacity. So let's do what we were doing with the AGM. That should say 60. I really should have looked at this graph more carefully. Anyway, so 50%, roughly 2,250 cycles. I would say this graph is on the modest size. Most batteries are going to be getting more life cycles than that. So for example, the battery I bought is rated for 2,000 plus cycles for an 80% depth of discharge, whereas this graph is recommending that would be, I don't know, maybe 1800 cycles. If we compare that, 80% depth of discharge, we're going to use the figure on my battery, which is 2000, or, let's use this more conservative one, 1800. Let's say that. Whereas if we're doing a 50% depth of discharge on an AGM, that's about 1000. So you're getting roughly double the amount of cycles you can go through before the battery becomes unusable. So whilst lithium batteries cost more upfront, in the long term, they work out cheaper. So it's a matter of whether you can afford that upfront cost. When I designed my system, I couldn't afford lithium batteries, so I opted for AGM. But unfortunately, after 2 years of solid use, they weren't maintaining voltage. They wouldn't even power my 12-volt lights. So I have now bought lithium batteries. And in the time that passed since I set up the system, because it took a while between when I actually built the system and actually started using it, so about 5 years, the cost of lithium batteries has come down significantly, and there are actually a lot of budget brands available now. The other thing to know about lithium batteries is they have a much steadier voltage as they discharge, which makes it more efficient and it's better for high draw devices. Whereas AGM, the voltage starts dropping very, very quickly. Lithium, up until about 90% depth of discharge, it's pretty flatline, and then it drops off very quickly at the end. Whereas AGM, it's just constantly going down. It is less efficient. One final thing about batteries before we move on. I know I've been banging on about batteries for a while now, but they could very well be the most expensive part of your system if you were building a beefy one. So it's important to get right. And I want you to listen carefully. Lithium batteries store more energy in the same footprint as an AGM battery. So if you think to earlier in the video when I was saying that monocrystalline solar panels have higher wattage in the same footprint when compared to a polycrystalline panel, it's the same thing. And what that's referred to is energy density. So lithium batteries have a much higher energy density. So what that means is you can have a higher capacity battery that weighs less and takes up less space. I want to give you a really quick example. It might blow your mind. The batteries I initially had in my van were two 330 amp hour AGM batteries. They weighed 72 kilos each. That is a lot of weight, and I could only use 50% of that. I have now upgraded to lithium batteries. I have two 300 amp hour lithium batteries, and they weigh, get this, not 72 kilos each, 27 kilos each. Isn't that wild? They're the same footprint, but remember, I'm getting double the usable energy. So bear that in mind. If size and weight are important, lithium might be the way to go. Now, as amazing as lithium sounds, I just want to say that sometimes an AGM battery is perfect for your setup. If you have low power needs, you're only using your setup every now and then, maybe you're only powering a 12 volt fridge and you've got, you want to charge your phones via USB, something like that. An AGM's probably perfect. Really low barrier to entry because it's cheap. Yes, it's going to weigh more, maybe take up a bit more space, but it's going to save you a lot of dosh. Now, there is a component of an electrical system that I haven't mentioned yet, but it is really, really important. And that is safety. Having a safe system is really important because you don't want it to catch fire, you don't want it to put people's lives in danger. One of the really important parts of having a safe system is firstly having fuses. Fuses protect your cables. And a fuse's job is to blow if there is an overcurrent. So too many amps flowing through the cables. It'll just shut it down. Because if there's too many amps going through, that causes excess heat, there could be a fire. It's dangerous. That is what fuses are. The thing with fuses is that if they blow, you've got to replace it. They're not reusable. You can also use breakers. You have probably seen these in your house. Might be referred to a safety switch. They will trip, if there is an overcurrent or a short circuit. And then you just reset it. It's reusable. Something else you should have in your system is a disconnect switch. This is usually put as bare minimum at the battery. So it cuts off the battery from the entire system. And so you can safely work on it. But you can have disconnect switches in various different places. And in fact, you can use a breaker as a disconnect switch. That's probably outside the scope of this video. So now you know the key components. Let's just go over that again. You need a way to harvest your energy, which is most likely going to be solar panels. Solar panels have varying voltages. To convert the voltage from these solar panels, or whatever way you're using to harvest energy, you're going to need a charge controller. Again, I recommend an MPPT charge controller so that you can safely distribute it around the circuit, which needs cables. As well as distributing the power, most people are going to want to be able to store the energy or the power that's being used. And that is done in the form of a battery. Lithium batteries are, I would say, the latest technology. They're the most efficient, and really for modern setups, it's probably the best way to go. The final thing, you need a safe system, because why would you have a system that could catch fire at any moment? I don't know, stupid idea. It's got to be safe. And that essentially is it.